A memory you can walk through. Close your eyes for a second and picture a spine of mountains rising like a serrated blade above the Caspian Sea. The air is thin and resinous, the wind tastes of stone, and every path seems designed to mislead anyone who doesn't belong. Now imagine I'm taking your hand and pulling you up those switchbacks with me, not as a tourist, not as a conqueror, but as someone who has sworn an oath to a man whose name still makes empires uneasy. Hasan-i Sabbah. If I had been one of his devoted Fida'i, one of the so-called assassins, this is what I would have lived through. Not the glossy legend, not the convenient rumor. I'm going to tell you what the fortresses looked like, what the valleys smelled like, how the Seljuk banners moved on the horizon, and what it cost, physically and spiritually, to become a human instrument in a war of ideas. And while you listen, you can treat it like an animist dive, a reconstruction of a life stitched from place, politics, and blood. You will hear echoes that Assassin's Creed fans will recognize, leaps of faith, hidden corridors, the quiet math of power. But we'll keep our feet planted in the real geography of 11th century Persia. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of documentary-style storytelling, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's the simplest way to tell me you want more of these journeys, and it genuinely helps me bring the next chapter to you. Now, step with me into the mountains. Part I, the road to Alamut. You would think the world announces its turning points with trumpets. It doesn't. For me, it began with dust. A caravan road outside Ray, the old city south of the Alborz range, where the Seljuk administration kept ledgers and the markets kept secrets. I was young enough to believe that history lived in palaces. Hasan-i Sabbah taught me history lived in corridors. Ray was a crossroads of tongues, Persian in the stalls, Arabic in the mosques, Turkic among the soldiers. The Seljuks, Sunnis who rode out of the steppe, had built an empire that stretched like a long shadow. Their viziers spoke in the language of order, taxes, courts, decrees. But in the alleyways, you could feel the fractures, Shia minorities, discontented craftsmen, scholars arguing over scripture as if the arguments could stop hunger. Hassan's invitation did not arrive as a royal letter. It was a phrase passed quietly from mouth to mouth. There is a path to certainty. When I followed that path, it led not to a single door, but to a chain of safe houses, mud brick rooms behind bakeries, a back garden with a well, a cellar with a narrow stair. Each place had one purpose, to move me without being seen. It felt eerily like the way Assassin's Creed depicts bureaus and informants, except this was not a game mechanic. It was survival. The final leg began at Kasvin, where the plains give way to the Dalamite highlands. From there, the route climbed into the Alborz, cliffs veined with snowmelt, forests of oak and hornbeam, and villages pressed into slopes like barnacles. The men guiding me did not boast. They watched. They counted. They read the terrain the way a sailor reads the sea. Then Alamut appeared. I won't pretend it looked like a fairy tale castle. It was harsher than legend, an eagle's nest of stone perched on a narrow ridge. But that was the genius. The rock itself was the first wall. The approach path was so tight that 10 defenders could make 100 attackers pay in blood. Below, the valley curled in green folds. Beyond, the peaks marched away into haze. You could see far enough to spot dust plumes from an army days before it arrived. Inside, the fortress was not a single keep, but a disciplined organism. Cisterns carved into rock held rainwater and snowmelt. Granaries were sealed against damp. Terraces grew herbs and hardy fruit trees. There were workshops for metal and leather, and, most important, rooms for writing. Hasan-i Sabbah was not just a warlord. He was a librarian with a strategist's mind. Scrolls and codices moved through his hands the way daggers do through the hands of men who think only of killing. You're probably expecting a dramatic initiation, torches, chanting, something theatrical. What I remember is silence and paperwork. Hasan insisted on clarity, names, origins, skills, what I believed, what I feared, what I could endure. He spoke softly, with the calm of someone who has already accepted the possibility of death. His eyes were not cruel. They were exact. Empires, he told me, are built on stories people agree to live inside. That became my first lesson. Our war was not only against Seljuk swords, it was against Seljuk certainty. The empire's claim was simple: one caliph, one orthodoxy, one law. Hasan's claim was more dangerous. That authority could be questioned, and that allegiance could be chosen. Training at Alamut was less about acrobatics than discipline. Yes, we learned to move across stone without noise, to climb ladders in the dark, to keep our breath steady when panic tries to take the body. But the deeper training was intellectual, how power flowed through families, guilds, and courts, how sermons shaped crowds, how rumors could make a city open its gates. If Assassin's Creed gives you eagle vision to highlight targets, Hasan gave us something colder: the ability to see networks. At night, the wind would hit the fortress like waves against a ship. I would stand on the ridge and taste the cold, and I'd feel the scale of what we were doing. Somewhere down on the plains, Seljuk patrols walked their routes, believing the mountains were empty. Somewhere farther, in Isfahan, officials wrote orders that would move thousands. And up here, in a place that barely deserved a dot on their maps, Hasan was building a state without borders, linked by trust, secrecy, and the shared understanding. One afternoon, a rider climbed up from the lowlands with news that even the empire could bleed. Nizam al-Mulk, the Seljuk vizier, was dead. By the time the rumor reached our walls, it had already become legend: disguise, dagger, betrayal. Hasan did not cheer. He simply recalculated. More patrols would come, more informants would be hunted. He ordered inventories checked again: grain, salt, lamp oil, arrowheads. Because in these mountains, power was logistics. A siege here was a question of winter. Could an army haul enough food up narrow paths to starve us before snow starved them? Life at Alamut felt almost monastics. Dawn began with the scrape of sandals on stone. Days were measured by the hammer of the smith, the scratch of reed pens, and the watch calls from the ridge. We ate plainly, not for virtue, but because luxury leaves evidence. Hasan lived with a severity that made the fortress itself feel like a vow. My first assignment was not a killing. It was a journey. Hasan sent me to memorize the land between Alamut and the cities, the passes where snow closed the road, the villages whose elders could hide a stranger, the shrines where pilgrims gathered and gossip flowed like water. He wanted me to know Persia the way a physician knows a body, where it was strong, where it was vulnerable, where it could be wounded, and where it could heal. As I walked those routes, I began to understand the paradox. The Seljuks held the plains, the roads, the armies. We held the mountains, the patience, and the idea that fear could be aimed like an arrow. Not the fear of random violence, but the fear that No rank, no title, no distance could guarantee safety. And the more I learned, the more I felt what you might feel if you stood where I stood, that the world below was loud and confident, but the mountains were listening, waiting for the moment to speak. Part 2. Cities of paper, cities of fire. If Alamut was the heart, the rest of our world was. A circulatory system, hidden rooms, coded letters, and mountain fortresses spaced like stepping stones across Persia. Hasan's genius was that he did not try to defeat the Seljuks in open battle. He tried to make their victories too expensive to celebrate. My next months were spent on roads that ran like veins through the empire. We moved with caravans, camel bells, wool bales, sacks of cumin and saffron, because commerce is camouflage. On the plains, the horizon was huge and careless, but the danger was intimate. A suspicious guard at a toll gate, a preacher who could point a crowd at you, a rival faction eager to buy favor with a confession. You would have loved the geography if you could forget the fear. The Alborz fell away into the salt, bright emptiness of the Dasht-e Kavir, where the earth turns white and the air shimmers as if the land is burning from underneath. Then the world rose again into stony ridges and cultivated valleys around Qom and Kashan. In the west, the Alborz Mountains stood like a second wall, sheltering tribes and bandits beyond easy imperial control. Persia was not one country. It was a quilt of climates, dialects, and loyalties. In Isfahan, Seljuk capital, city of domes and bureaucracy, the empire felt unstoppable. Paper ruled there as much as steel. You could stand in the bazaar and hear gold weigh down a merchant's scales, then step into a madrasa and hear a scholar weigh down a sentence with authority. The Friday mosques' arches seemed built to hold up not only stone, but certainty. And yet, even in Isfahan, people whispered. They complained about tax collectors. They laughed at officials. They prayed in ways that revealed private loyalties. Behind the domes you could see the machinery, scribes with ink-stained fingers, tax registers rolled like carpets, and mounted couriers who could cover in a day what a peasant might not walk in a week. The Seljuks kept a lattice of garrisons and way stations. Every major road had a post where officials could stop you, ask your business, and decide whether your story fit the empire's version of reality. If Assassin's Creed ever made you feel watched in a crowd, Isfahan was that sensation, made of laws and lances. Hasan had instructed us to observe points of pressure. In a city, that meant, where do soldiers get paid? And who delays the coins? Who controls the grain? Which families sponsor the sermon? Where do couriers sleep? Where do judges take bribes? It was intelligence work in the modern sense, except the cost of a mistake was not a failed mission, but a body displayed in a square. Sometimes the work was bloodless. I carried letters, thin sheets with innocuous poetry that, to the trained eye, held instructions in the spacing of lines. I met contacts in bathhouses where steam blurred faces and everyone was equal in a towel. I listened in caravanserais to travelers who thought they were merely gossiping, and I learned which garrisons were hungry, which commanders were vain, and which roads were closing under winter snow. But eventually, the empire pushed back. Seljuk forces began probing the Nizari network in the mountains, trying to cut our routes, to isolate Alamut like a limb they could amputate. I saw one of their columns from a ridge above a narrow pass, spears like a field of reeds, banners snapping in wind, dust rising behind them in a long bruise across the land. They looked organized, professional, and heavy. Our strength was not weight, it was terrain. In the fortresses allied to Alamut, places like Lamasar, perched on its own ridge with sheer drops, and the smaller strongholds that guarded ravines, every stone had a purpose. Battlements were angled to deflect arrows. Storage rooms were buried deep for coolness. Water channels were protected as if they were arteries, because they were. When a siege came, you could hear it before you saw it. The low animal noise of thousands of men, the groan of ropes, the thunk of stones. The Seljuks tried to bring the plains up to the mountains, and the mountains refused. I want to be honest about something. There were moments I wished for the clean morality of a game. In Assassin's Creed, your target has a dossier and a dramatic confession. In real life, power is messy. A Seljuk officer might be brutal in one village and generous in another. A judge could be corrupt and still truly believe he was protecting order. And among our own people, not everyone was pure. Some used the movement to settle grudges, to gain status, to hide crimes. Hasan's strictness was partly a response to that. If discipline cracked, our legitimacy cracked with it. The first time I saw open combat up close was not a grand battle. It was a skirmish at a river crossing where our couriers had to pass. Seljuk cavalry rode in expecting peasants. Instead, they met men who knew every rock and reed. Arrows flew, the water turned dark, and the shouting echoed off the hills. It lasted minutes and felt like hours. When it ended, the river kept moving as if nothing had happened, carrying away the evidence with cold indifference. Later, when I returned to Alamut, the fortress felt different to me. I had seen how quickly a road could turn into a trap, how a rumor could close a city's gates, how soldiers could burn a village simply to send a message. I realized Alamut was not only a refuge, it was a statement. It told the empire, you do not own every height. You do not define every truth. That winter, snow sealed the passes. The Seljuk army withdrew to the lowlands, promising to return in spring. We used the time the way Hasan always used time, to build. We repaired walls. We copied texts. We taught new recruits languages and patience. We planted terraces and checked cisterns. We treated endurance like a weapon. And in the long evenings, as the wind rattled shutters and the lamps made small islands of light, I understood the real psychological battlefield. The Seljuks wanted us to feel isolated. Hasan wanted us to feel connected, part of an invisible city stretched across mountains and deserts, alive in the minds of people who had never seen Alamut but still whispered its name like a prayer or a threat. Part 3. The Levant, where empires collide. There is a moment, leaving Persia, when the mountains loosen their grip and the world opens into long corridors of travel. For me, that moment came on the road west, when the air stopped smelling like Alborz pine and began to smell like dry steppe and distant sea. Hasan sent me with a simple instruction: see the other wars, learn how men justify them. Because while we fought the Seljuks from our heights, a new pressure was arriving from the far horizon. Frankish armies, what later generations would call crusaders, had crossed Anatolia and poured into the Levant like a tide. Cities that had traded with Byzantines, Arabs, Armenians, and Turks for centuries suddenly found themselves argued over as if they were prizes in a holy contest. The journey itself was a lesson in scale. From Hamadan, the road threaded toward the Zagros, where nomad tents dotted the slopes and shepherd dogs barked at strangers. Beyond, the land fell into Mesopotamia's wide breadth, The Tigris and Euphrates, brown and patient, carrying silt and history. In Baghdad, the great Abbasid city, the caliph's name still held ceremonial weight, even as real power shifted to Seljuk commanders. The libraries were vast, the mosques crowded, the streets loud with trade. Yet the mood was anxious, as if everyone could feel the map tightening. From there, I moved north and west, Mosul, then into the hills that lead toward Aleppo. You could feel how many hands had touched this region. A caravanserai might have Greek graffiti on its stones, Arabic prayers scratched beside it, and Armenian merchant marks on the beams. The Levant was not a border. It was a membrane where cultures pressed together. Aleppo was my first true taste of frontier politics. Seljuk factions competed with local dynasties. Alliances shifted like sand. In the citadel, you could see the military logic. Thick walls, deep ditches, a city wrapped around its fortress like armor around a heart. But outside the walls, markets still opened, bread still baked, children still played. War didn't stop life, it distorted it. And then, farther south, the landscape changed again. The air grew softer. Olive trees replaced scrub. The scent of the Mediterranean arrived like an argument you could not ignore. Near the coast, rumor traveled faster than caravans. People spoke of Antioch's fall, of Jerusalem taken, of new castles being razed by newcomers who didn't know the names of the hills they claimed. I saw the newcomers' engineering up close, timber towers being assembled like giant puzzles, trenches cut into hard earth, and stonework being adapted from older Roman and Byzantine ruins. At a distance, one siege looked almost orderly, banners, horns, disciplined lines, until the first projectiles flew and the air filled with splintered wood and dust. Local defenders answered from walls that had seen other wars, pouring down arrows and boiling water, praying in languages their attackers could not understand. Watching it, I understood that holy war was a label men used to make logistics and hunger sound noble. You might expect our order to treat the Franks as a simple enemy. Hasan's approach was colder. He saw them as another vector in a crowded equation. The Seljuks fought them, local rulers fought each other. Fatimid agents from Egypt played their own games. In that chaos, a small disciplined network could survive if it understood every player's incentives. That is why I met men who would later be remembered more in legend than in paperwork. Dais traveling as scholars, couriers wearing the clothes of farmers, elders who mapped loyalties the way cartographers map coastlines. When people talk about the assassins as if we were only blades, they miss the real instrument, information. There were fortresses here too, older, rougher cousins of Alamut. Some sat on spurs above river valleys. Others hid in pine-covered ridges where mist could swallow a rider in minutes. They were not yet the iconic Masyaf of Assassin's Creed. Sinan in that era was still in the future, but the idea was already here. Stone refuges linked by trust, each one a node in a network that could not be beheaded by capturing a single castle. I spent nights on battlements listening to languages layer over one another. Arabic in prayer, Armenian in trade, Frankish words hard as stones, Turkic commands cracking like whips. In those moments, the creed that later gets quoted in games made visceral sense. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. Not as an excuse for cruelty, but as a reminder that every faction claimed truth, and yet every faction broke its own rules when power demanded it. One evening, a local commander asked me casually whether our people could reach a certain rival in his bedchamber. He spoke as if he were ordering a piece of furniture. I remember the disgust rising in me and the clarity. This was how our reputation worked. People didn't have to know our doctrine. They only had to believe our reach was real. Fear, once established, became a currency everyone tried to spend. I did not answer him with promises. I answered with questions. What would he offer? What would he risk? What story would he tell afterward? Hasan would have approved. The blade, he taught us, is the final line in a long argument. If you want a moment that feels like a synchronization point from Assassin's Creed, this is it. Standing on a high tower above a foreign city, letting your eyes sweep the rooftops, the roads, the fields beyond. From up there, you could see the logic of the place, where the guards walked, where the crowds gathered, where a messenger could vanish. But unlike a game, there was no glowing marker, only judgment, only consequences. When I finally returned east, I carried more than reports. I carried a sense of how fragile empires really are. In Persia, the Seljuks looked immense. In the Levant, they were only one predator among many. The world was changing in multiple directions at once, and Hasan's mountain state, small as it was, had positioned itself to endure in that turbulence. And as I rode back toward the Alborz with dust in my teeth and winter ahead, I realized you and I are still living inside the kind of collision I witnessed then. Ideologies claiming certainty, borders shifting under people's feet, and ordinary lives trying to find a stable story to inhabit. Part 4. The Old Man of the Mountain and What He Left Behind. When people later called Hasan-i Sabbah the Old Man of the Mountain, they were trying to turn him into a fairy tale. It's easier to fear a myth than to face a method. The truth I lived with was stranger. Hasan was not old when he took Alamut, but he was already austere, already living as if his body were merely a tool for a longer project. Years passed in a pattern that was both repetitive and tense. Spring meant roads reopened, couriers moved, Seljuk patrols tested our edges. Summer meant repairs, harvests on terraces, and the constant management of alliances. Autumn meant anticipating siege season, checking stores again and again as if we could measure safety in sacks of grain. Winter meant the fortress becoming an island of stone above a sea of snow. If you had walked with me through Alamut in those years, you would have noticed the place changing, not growing richer. Hasan hated that, but growing denser with knowledge. A new map copied carefully, a commentary on theology debated in low voices, a report from the south pinned under a stone to keep the wind from stealing it. It felt at times like living inside an archive that happened to have battlements. Hasan's governance was as strict inwardly as it was defiant outwardly. He demanded discipline, not because he loved punishment, but because he feared corruption more than he feared the Seljuks. A fortress can survive an army. It can die from rot. He barred extravagance, punished theft, and expected personal restraint even from his closest lieutenants. The movement could not afford to look like just another dynasty, because then it would lose the moral leverage that made people listen. And yet, no matter how much he tried to keep us clean, the world kept turning our story into rumor. Let me anchor you in the physical reality, because stone and soil are harder to lie about than legends. Alamut sits in the Rudbar Valley system, where narrow gorges funnel wind and sound. In clear weather, you can trace the ridgelines like the ribs of a giant animal. Our allied castles were chosen the same way, not for beauty, but for control of Routes. Lamasar guarding approaches, smaller towers watching river bends, and southern strongholds in Kohistan, extending our reach toward Khorasan and the desert roads beyond. The rumors, meanwhile, grew in the lowlands like mold in damp cloth. Sunni polemicists used a slur, Hashashin, to paint us as drugged fanatics. Later writers and travelers embroidered it into the old man of the mountain fantasy, popular far from the Caspian. I never saw men drugged into obedience. I saw men argued into it, educated into it, and sometimes frightened into it. That may be less sensational, but it is also more credible and more unsettling. There were psychological operations, too, the kind a modern intelligence officer would recognize. You may have heard the tale of a ruler waking to find a dagger planted beside his pillow as a warning. I won't describe methods. I will only say Hasan understood something timeless. If you can reach the center of a man's security once, you may never need to strike. The uncertainty does the work for you. You've heard the legends, gardens of paradise, blind devotion. Standing inside the real Alamut, those stories feel like propaganda with good marketing. What I saw was harder and in a way more frightening. Deliberate recruitment, careful education, and a willingness to use targeted violence as a political language. Not random slaughter, signals. A small number of deaths meant to prevent larger wars, or at least to make our enemies hesitate before lighting their torches. That doesn't make it simple to defend. There were nights I lay awake questioning whether our signals were truly restraint or just another form of control. There were days I watched villagers flinch at the mention of our name and felt shame mingle with pride. If Assassin's Creed teaches anything beneath the spectacle, it's that every order believes it is saving the world, and that belief is dangerous. The Seljuks, for their part, never stopped trying to crush us. They besieged our outposts, bribed defectors, spread sermons calling us heretics. Sometimes they succeeded. I attended funerals without bodies because a man had died far away and no one could retrieve him. I listened to reports of fortresses in the south holding out through hunger until relief arrived. I learned that endurance is not heroic, it is exhausting. And then came the quietest turning point of all, Hasan's death. There was no grand ceremony, no thunder. The mountains simply kept breathing. Leaders gathered, orders were relayed, watch shifts continued. It was as if the fortress had trained itself not to depend on one man's heartbeat. That, in a sense, was his greatest achievement. He built continuity. But if you ask me what he truly left behind, it wasn't a list of enemies removed. It was a template that a small community, anchored in difficult terrain and bound by shared conviction, can punch far above its size by understanding the psychology of power. That empires rely on the belief that they are inevitable, and that inevitable is just a story like any other. Centuries later, other storms would come. Steppe riders with a different kind of terror, armies that did not negotiate with symbols. Some of our fortresses would fall, some records would burn. Alamut itself would be broken open like a skull. But even when stone is shattered, an idea can persist. Sometimes as truth, sometimes as distortion, sometimes as entertainment in a video game that turns our shadows into parkour. So when you hear the word assassin today, I want you to remember the map beneath the myth. The Alborz ridges above the Caspian, the deserts that punish arrogance, the cities where paper and prayer shape crowds, and the narrow passes where a handful of people tried to rewrite the rules of allegiance. And if you're still with me here at the end, subscribe to the channel and like the video. It tells the algorithm, and it tells me that you want more history you can feel in your bones. Your support is what lets this series continue. Until the next memory, keep your eyes on the ridgelines.